Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist, Ben Gallagher. This one's a really good one for reviewing and consolidating a huge number of areas from the course. So I'm hoping you've only come across this one quite late on in your study, or you're following in the sequence that I've recommended. This is Blood 1. It's just 2 lessons in this playlist. This is the overview that brings together lots and lots of different areas. The second one looks at the kidney, which is how the blood is cleaned. This is from the GCSE specification, and as always, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you. This is the really important slide from this presentation. This is where we're going to look at blood, what it contains, and what all those different parts do, where they come from, what part of the curriculum have we studied them previously. We're also going to use this to do a quick review of several main parts of your syllabus, like the circulatory system, respiratory system, digestive system, but we'll do those on the following slides. So to start off with, we're talking about the blood. What is it and what's in it? So if I put up here just a blood vessel, this could be an artery, capillary, or a vein, it doesn't matter. I've just drawn it in a very generic way. Let's think about what's inside there. Well, you know you've got liquid to carry all the cells and the different elements around. That liquid element to the blood is called the plasma. Everything else floats around in it. Now, of course, the bit that you'll be very familiar with the blood are these things. These are red blood cells. Now, think back to what we've studied before in circulatory and respiratory system. The red blood cells transport oxygen around your body. They contain a very important protein called hemoglobin. It's hemoglobin that gives red blood cells their red color and makes your blood red. Without the red blood cells and their hemoglobin, you wouldn't be able to carry oxygen around your body, which means you wouldn't be able to deliver it to cells, so your cells wouldn't be able to do respiration. So you could revise respiration from thinking about this and thinking about the red blood cells within blood. You could also think about red blood cells as specialist cells and how they've differentiated. And in the case of red blood cells, they filled themselves up with as much hemoglobin as possible, so did as much protein synthesis as possible, then broke down their nucleus because it was just in the way. They also flattened themselves out to increase their surface area relative to their volume, which makes them much better for transfer of oxygen in and out. So you've got surface area to volume ratio, you've got diffusion, you've got transport through membranes. So much knowledge needs to link into understanding all these things. If we've talked about red blood cells, then remember we've got white blood cells, but there are two main types. You've got phagocytes, which look like these. And remember, phagocytes are the ones that patrol all the way around your body looking for antigens. Antigens are the marker on cell surfaces. And on all of your cells in your body, you have self-antigens. So the phagocytes are checking every cell to see if it's got a self-antigen. If it does have a self-antigen, they leave it alone and go, that's one of ours, that belongs to us. If they find a cell that doesn't have a self-antigen, they do phagocytosis to destroy it. It's one of your body's main lines of defense that keeps you well when there's so many pathogens floating about. But of course, we don't just have phagocytes as white blood cells, we also have lymphocytes. Now, lymphocytes are far more clever, they're very specialized. Lymphocytes produce antibodies. Now, if you remember, an antibody is a protein that sticks out of the lymphocyte that has a shape on the end that's unique to a certain body of a pathogen. If that body of the pathogen locks onto the antibody, sticking out of any of these 3 lymphocytes I've got on there, and you'll notice the antibodies are all different shapes on the 3 I've put on there, showing that they could bind to different pathogens. But if a pathogen locks onto it, that lymphocyte can multiply, create loads and loads of copies of itself, flooding the blood with loads and loads of antibodies. So let's add that to here. You might just have antibodies floating around in the blood. Those antibodies can lock onto pathogens and either directly destroy them or kind of tag them and make them really bright and obvious to attract phagocytes for phagocytes to come and destroy them. Antibodies in the blood can also, of course, work as antitoxins by binding to toxins and chemicals that might be released by the pathogens that are making you ill. Or indeed, if you think back to the lesson on monoclonal antibodies, the antibodies could work as antivenoms, binding to the toxins of snake bites or spider bites. So it could be used as an antivenom. If anything I'm saying here isn't familiar, then you need to go back to those playlists, back to those videos and revise your knowledge. So as I said, this is a consolidation of lots of stuff. Let's have a look at what else is in there. You've got another type of cell, these little yellowy ones that I've put on here. These are platelets. Now, we talked about these when we talked about body defenses and body barriers. Platelets only really come into use when there's a wound. If you've got a cut, then the platelets in your blood will kind of explode like a piece of popcorn, release their fibrinogen from within them, and that fibrinogen will plug the hole and form a scab. That scab is a temporary barrier to prevent pathogens coming in, but they're floating around in your blood and you know about those as well. So we're really starting to build up a lot of stuff in the blood. Let's keep going. Your blood is full of nutrients floating around in the plasma are the monomer units that you absorbed from digestion. So think about what some of those are: glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, and think about why you need them. Glucose for respiration, so the body can produce energy, so cells can produce energy. Amino acids as the essential building block for building proteins, and proteins do everything. Fatty acids and glycerol, which can be stuck back together in cells and turned into lipids, which are a key component of membranes, and then various vitamins and various minerals for various purposes. But those nutrients travel around in the plasma. That's how they get from the small intestine, where you absorb them, to the cells that require them. Also floating around in the plasma will be hormones. Hopefully you very recently watched my lessons on hormones, and you've got things like estrogen, testosterone, FSH, growth hormone, insulin, all these different hormones. And you'll notice I've put several different shaped things. As a blue star, a yellow star, a sort of purple cross over there, because they're all different shaped hormones, all doing different things. And if we analysed your blood at any time, we'd find different levels of different hormones in there, depending on what your body's requirements were at that stage. So you've got all these hormones in there as well. Also dissolved in the plasma, you'll have carbon dioxide, which is the waste product of respiration. It's dissolved in the plasma because it's got to be on its way back to the lungs to be got rid of and to be expired. Last thing, and this is something we'll talk about more in the next video on kidneys, you've also got something called urea. Urea is a toxin that the body produces in the liver. We talked about that in a previous video, but it's really where the liver takes excess amino acids that the body doesn't need and breaks them down so they're not acting as a solute in the blood, which could affect osmosis and affect blood pressure. So the liver breaks them down into urea. That's a toxin that's in the blood that the kidneys then need to get rid of. So have a look at this diagram now. 10 minutes ago, if I'd have said to you, make a list of everything that's in the blood, you probably would have gone, right, red blood cells, white blood cells. Oh, I'm struggling now. But look at the amount of stuff that you know that is in the blood, that you've studied, that you can fully explain the reasons for every single one of those things. So take a screenshot of this. This is the really important bit, but we're going to do a quick review of where the blood goes in the body, what it picks up and why. So we can't talk about blood without talking about the heart, because the heart is the pump that delivers that blood all around the body. Now there's a whole video on this, so go back and watch that if you want a really good detailed run through of the heart and how it works as the pump. We're just going to do a quick review to remind you. So the heart, it's roughly kind of strawberry shaped. It's tilted slightly on its side. It's got ways in and out of the heart. That's where the blood vessels are attached. And if we're quickly thinking about those blood vessels, you've got three main types. The major two are the arteries and the veins, and arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins bring it back. Capillaries, for completeness, are the really, really small blood vessels. That's the site of exchange. They're 1 cell thick, really, really narrow walls. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail in a minute, but that's where glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide, all those things get transferred. Let's look back to how the heart is structured internally. So you've got walls inside the heart. Now those are very, very muscular, strong walls. The heart is a very powerful organ. Now we've got blood coming into the heart through the vena cava that's been all around the body, from the upper body coming down and the lower body coming back up. That blood's going to be deoxygenated because it's given its oxygen out to all the cells that need it so they can do respiration. So the hemoglobin in those cells is not carrying oxygen. That blood's now going to move into the heart, into that first chamber, which is the right atrium, through a one-way valve into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle gives a powerful contraction, that's going to push the blood up through another valve, through the pulmonary artery. Artery because it's going away from the heart, Pulmonary, because it's linked to the lungs. Anything to do with the lungs is called pulmonary. That blood goes up to the lungs where it's going to spread out over the alveoli. We'll cover those in a second just for completeness. Pick up all the oxygen, come back to the heart as oxygenated blood. So the hemoglobin is now oxyhemoglobin. Re-enter through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, through the one-way valve, left ventricle, which is the most muscular chamber. And when the left ventricle contracts, it's going to push the blood out through this major artery, which is the aorta. The aorta is going to branch in two because that blood's got to go all the way around the lower body, everything below the lungs, splitting into capillaries when it gets there, delivering what it needs to deliver, picking up what it needs to pick up, and then heading back to the vena cava. Same when you're going up around the upper body. So if you look back at the top of the aorta there, it goes up and around, up to the brain, up to my arms, to my shoulder muscles, whatever else, delivering its oxygen, delivering its glucose, picking up any toxins or anything it needs before coming back. So this is now a really complete diagram. But we've gone very fast there. If you want me to explain that more slowly and more carefully, looking at each chamber, go back to the video on the heart, which is circulatory system 1. Take a screenshot of this if it's going to be useful, but let's move on now and look at those blood vessels in a little bit more detail. So, to compare them, if we're looking at the artery and the vein, arteries and veins have the hole through the middle of them. Remember, they're a tube. The hole through the middle of them is called the lumen, and the lumen has a very smooth lining to allow the blood cells to move very freely, minimal friction, because if there was friction, blood cells could get caught on the sides, could get trapped, could lump together, form blood clots. Now you'll notice the lumen of the vein is much wider. It's much bigger, so the blood can go more slowly. It's got more space to move around. The lumen of the artery, the actual hole where the blood flows, is really quite narrow. That's to ensure the blood goes fast. It's at a higher pressure because there's less space. So you're delivering that oxygenated blood as quickly as possible. But of course, because of that high pressure in the artery has quite a thick layer of muscle and elastic fibers and a thick wall around the outside of that. So even though the vein's got a bigger lumen, overall, both arteries and veins are a very similar size because of the thickness of the walls and the muscular and elastic layers that you have on an artery, and that's to withstand the high pressure that's within them. If we're comparing the two in a table, which is quite often how you'll ask me to do it in the exam, artery, narrow lumen, vein has a wider lumen, thick wall in the artery, thin wall in the vein because there's much lower pressure in the vein. In the artery, you've got thick muscular elastic layer, again, to allow that slight expansion under pressure, but to recoil back. It's a thinner muscle and elastic layer in the vein. Artery's got high pressure, veins got lower pressure. Just a couple of extra points on that. Arteries don't have valves in them, but veins do. Because the lumen is quite large and the blood's going quite slow, you need to have valves, otherwise the blood might come backwards. So to keep things moving in one direction, veins have valves in them called pocket valves. Also, you can feel a pulse in an artery because as the heart pumps, blood flies along the artery and it kind of pulses as it goes through. Then it slows as the heart relaxes. Heart beats again, another pulse of blood. Heart relaxes, another pulse. And you can feel it as the blood moves down. So if you're looking for a pulse, you must feel an artery. The main ones you can feel a pulse on, of course, are in the neck and in the wrist, which is why that's where people check for a pulse. If we compare the capillaries on this one, capillaries very small because they're the site of exchange. That's roughly the scale of capillary compared to these guys, tiny. So if I enlarge that so we can see it, you can see that I've drawn that capillary there, showing the cells. Those little blue dots, those are the nuclei inside each one of those cells. It's one cell thick, so that things can move out of the capillary, or they can move back in if it's collecting things like oxygen, if these are capillaries in the lungs. But whatever happens, that movement of stuff in and out, because of the thin walls, it allows fast and efficient diffusion. So let's look at those capillaries now in the alveoli for where they're going to pick up the oxygen. And again, this is just review quickly of lots that we've studied previously, but it's now linking that stuff together. Now you've got wider knowledge. So blood supply in the alveoli. The alveoli are in the lungs. They're these little air sacs. Air's going to come in. It's going to exchange its oxygen for carbon dioxide inside the alveoli. So if we zoom in on one of these air sacs up above me and enlarge them, you can see again, it's one cell thick in the walls of the alveoli. What that means is when air comes in containing the oxygen, that 20% oxygen that's in air, most of the air around us is nitrogen, roughly 80% nitrogen. But when that air comes in, that oxygen can move directly into a capillary because the capillary is pressed right against the alveoli. Both of them are only 1 cell thick. The red blood cells have to move in single file, so they're really all exposed to where the oxygen is going to come. And the oxygen can just diffuse through the wall of the alveoli, through the wall of the capillary and into the red blood cell, where of course it will bind to the hemoglobin to make oxyhemoglobin. Now we know that there's carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma, so that carbon dioxide has to diffuse out. Remember, diffusion is because of the concentration gradient. So diffusion of carbon dioxide into the alveoli, where it can then move out. And of course, some of the oxygen that came in is also going to go out as well. So not all of it moves, not all of the oxygen is absorbed. It's only about 4%, because what goes out is still 16% oxygen, but it's now 4% carbon dioxide. You've exchanged those gases. Now, it would be a very inefficient system if there was only one capillary covering an alveoli. So it's shown on this diagram that the alveoli are totally covered in a mesh of capillaries. That's to make use of every single bit of surface of the alveoli to get as much oxygen taken in as is possible. So we've quickly reviewed circulatory system, we've quickly reviewed respiratory system. Let's quickly look at the blood's role as it comes to the small intestine, where it's going to pick up so much of the nutrients that it needs. So this is the walls of the small intestine. Here's the food traveling through the small intestine, those now monomer units that have been digested by the enzymes. We want that food to move into the blood. Okay, but to do that, you need to have a really good blood supply going through the walls of the small intestine. But remember, everything in your body is working on efficiency. And to make this a more efficient exchange, we need a larger surface area for absorption. So that inner wall is heavily folded into villi. But of course, think about the blood still. We need the blood to get in contact with the food, so the blood vessels have to go right down into those villi to maximize the uptake. So there's a huge blood supply to the small intestine, as well as a huge blood supply to the lungs, because those are the two sites in your body where there's the main uptake of the things you need to keep you alive. The nutrients in the small intestine, the oxygen in the blood. So there's a huge blood supply to those. Just for completeness, let's finish this off by reminding you that the villi also have cells on their surface, and that those cells are highly folded to give even greater surface area for absorption of nutrients. So the blood supply would just be sort of behind this row of cells there. Those are microvilli, those tiny little foldings, and that those cells would also contain loads and loads of mitochondria, because mitochondria do respiration to provide the energy for active transport. Because remember, you can only absorb 50% of the nutrients, or once you get to that kind of balance of 50-50, there's no concentration gradient. So if you want to absorb nutrients after that, you have to actively transport them, which requires energy provided by respiration, which are done by the mitochondria. So there's a lot of information here and a lot of information in this presentation, but it shouldn't be anything that you don't already know. So as I said at the start, this is very much a revision lesson. That first slide was a really important one. Hopefully you find that useful, where you can see all the different things that are in the blood and how it links to so many systems within your body. But that very quick review of the main systems, the circulatory, respiratory and digestive systems, or certainly the sites where exchange happens with the blood, is really important stuff. Go back to those videos, watch them again, revise them and review them. They're all in the human physiology playlist, the respiratory, circulatory and digestive system. It's such important bits of biology. The next video is this one, the kidney. This looks at how the blood gets cleaned, how the urea gets taken out, and how the water gets balanced by the kidney, which is our final physiological system, the renal system. So head to that one next, please. If you haven't done so already, please do remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Give this video a like if you find it helpful, and do head over to my Facebook page, where there's lots of infographics with lots of extra bits of biology that might help you out. Thank you.